Okay, so you want to talk vampires? Let's talk vampires. And specifically, that whole no reflection thing. It's like, it's classic vampire lore, right? But the article you sent over, The Myth of Vampires and Their Reflections, it really digs into the WHY. Like, why is this idea so sticky? Get ready, because we're about to do some serious myth busting today.
Yeah, it's so interesting how something like so simple on the surface can actually point to something way deeper, something that just kind of resonates across cultures, across like centuries even.
Right. It's wild. And the article, it takes us way back, talking about how, like, ancient cultures, they didn't just see mirrors as mirrors. They were almost like, I don't know, windows to the soul. So to not have a reflection, that's not just spooky. That's like a sign of something missing, something dot other.
Exactly. It's like an instant signal. This thing, this vampire, is not just outside of society. It's outside of like the natural order of things, you know?
Mhm.
It makes us question, like, what does it even mean to be human if this thing can exist?
And it's not just one culture, right? We've got vampire myths all over the place, but the article points out they're not all the same flavor of vampire. Some are all about the blood, some are about draining life force, some are more like vengeful spirits. It's a whole buffet of vampire out there.
It really is, and it makes you think, right? Because for all their differences, they all tap into this, like, primal fear, death, disease, the stuff we just don't understand. Every culture takes the vampire and kind of shapes it to fit their own anxieties.
Which I guess brings us to the vampire we, I don't know and love to be afraid of today. Fangs! Gotta have the fangs. Blood drinking, obviously. And of course, the whole sunlight is basically a laser beam of death thing. The article, it highlights how this version, the one we're most familiar with, it really takes root around like 16th century Western Europe. And when you think about it, that was a time of like crazy superstition around death. I mean, you've got the plague, you've got the very real fear of being buried alive. Oh, absolutely. Decomposing bodies, something coming back from the grave. Those weren't just stories. Those were real fears, very present in their daily lives. And the vampire, with the whole aversion to sunlight needing to feed on the living, it becomes this potent symbol for all that anxiety.
Okay, so we've got like ancient beliefs, a healthy dose of fear of death, but then the article throws us a curveball, rabies. Apparently, massive outbreak, 18th century, Hungary and Romania. And get this, some of the symptoms, way too close to vampire lore for comfort. Sensitivity to light, not being able to go near water, even the aggression. Suddenly those vampire stories, not so far-fetched, right?
It really is remarkable how these like real life events, they get all tangled up with the myths and legends.
Yeah.
Imagine you're hearing these stories, you know what rabies does to a person. It's easy to see how those fears would kind of bleed into each other, make the vampire myth even more terrifying.
So we're talking centuries of folklore, possible disease outbreaks, and then Hollywood decides to crash the party. Because bam! 1931, Bela Lugosi walks onto the scene as Dracula, and the whole vampire image, it gets a serious makeover.
It's true. Suddenly the vampire, it's not just this like monstrous figure. It's suave, it's powerful, almost seductive. Lugosi's performance, it really changed the game. But even before that, you have Nosferatu in 1922, which really cemented that whole sunlight weakness. I love how every generation, they kind of add their own spin, their own layer to the myth.
Man, from ancient myths and rabies outbreaks to full-on Hollywood makeovers, the vampire has definitely been through it, huh? But here's where it really gets me. Why is that missing reflection such a big deal? It's more than just like a spooky visual, right? What's the deeper meaning there?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the article, it makes this point that those empty reflections, it's not just about what vampires don't have, but what they represent. And it's so interesting how those fears, they kind of morph and change over time.
Okay, so like, what kind of fears are we talking about out here? Give me an example.
All right, well, let's take the Victorians, right? Dracula hits the scene, and everybody's suddenly obsessed with this whole vampire thing. But when you dig a little deeper, they were also dealing with all these anxieties about, like, societal change, immigration, the Industrial Revolution. Their whole world was transforming, and that's got to be scary.
So they're looking at Dracula and they're seeing like a reflection of their own anxieties about the world changing around them.
Bingo. It wasn't just about some monster hiding in the shadows. It was about the shadows of their own society. That fear of the unknown creeping in. And then you fast forward a few decades to, like, the Cold War, and what happens? Vampires. Perfect metaphor for the communist threat. Lurking in the shadows, ready to, drain the life out of the West. It's almost like every generation, they take the vampire and they mold it into the shape of their own fears.
Wow. Okay, so then what about us? What do we see when we look at a vampire today, knowing they can't even look at themselves in a mirror?
Now that is the interesting part, isn't it? Because the modern vampire, the one we see in movies and books and stuff, it's almost like a blank slate. They can be about so many things now, unchecked corporate power, the way information gets twisted,
Yeah.
even like our anxieties about technology taking over.
Man, that is quite a journey for one mythical creature, from ancient superstitions about souls to like modern day anxieties about, well, everything. It's kind of like these myths, as crazy as they can get, they're holding up a mirror, right? Showing us what we're afraid of.
Yeah, and the article really drives that point home. It's not just about what we see when we look at a vampire. It's about that blank space where the reflection should be, the thing that's missing. It forces us to confront our own gaze, our own fears, and maybe realize that the scariest monsters are the ones we create ourselves.
So it's like the myth is saying, hey, if you're really looking for a scare, take a good look in the mirror.
Right. And the wild thing is, this whole idea, this fear and reflection thing, it's not just vampires. You see it in folklore, like across the board. These stories that make us look at the darker parts of ourselves, the darker parts of our cultures.
It's like we're holding up a mirror to what it means to be human.
Exactly.
Mm.
And I think that's why these myths, even the ones that seem like totally out there, they still speak to us. They're not just a fun scare. They're a glimpse into our own nature, our own anxieties about the world.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible. We started with this, like, seemingly simple question, why don't vampires have reflections? And we ended up, we went everywhere, through history, folklore, even a little detour into disease outbreaks.
It's amazing what you can learn from one little question, right? And I think what we've uncovered is it's about more than just vampires. It's about how powerful these myths can be, how our fears evolve and change, and how we project those fears onto the things we don't understand.
So next time you catch your reflection, just, take a second, really look. What do you see staring back? And what does that tell you about the things that scare us, both as individuals and as, like, a whole society? Until next time on the deep dive, keep asking those questions and maybe keep an eye on your reflections. You never know what you might find.